Moments ago, the United Kingdom was stunned as Keir Starmer made an admission on live television that has shaken the very foundations of Westminster and left the public in absolute disbelief. The ITV studio, normally a stage for controlled interviews and political spin, descended into chaos as Starmer, looking visibly strained, revealed details that insiders say were never meant to see the light of day. Within seconds, social media exploded. Clips of the interview were being shared faster than the government could respond. Hashtags trending nationwide as millions debated what had just unfolded. The normally composed Prime Minister seemed cornered, his voice faltering as he admitted a series of decisions that critics are already calling a betrayal of trust, a collapse of moral responsibility, and a failure of leadership on an unprecedented scale. It is being described by sources inside Number 10 as a historic moment of political reckoning, one that could reshape the Labour Party and, many say, the future of Britain itself. The admission came during a tense segment when Starmer was pressed on a series of confidential agreements made during the last fiscal crisis, deals that insiders now claim were intended to benefit select elites while leaving ordinary citizens to bear the brunt of economic turmoil. Starmer's eyes betrayed a mixture of fear and calculation, a politician suddenly aware that the narrative he had painstakingly built over years was crumbling in real time. As he spoke, and ITV's cameras captured every flicker of hesitation, every pause that signalled both the gravity of his words and the knowledge that once they aired, there was no turning back. For the first time in his political career, Starmer was not controlling the story. He was being consumed by it. Across the country, reaction was immediate and fierce. Labour MPs, many of whom had remained loyal to the leader through years of parliamentary battles, were reportedly in a state of turmoil. Sources describe frantic phone calls, cabinet meetings cut short, and aides rushing to contain the fallout. Opposition leaders, including Nigel Farage and Richard Tice, seized the moment, denouncing Starmer's decisions as a betrayal of democracy itself. Social media users, meanwhile, flooded platforms with outrage, sharing clips of Starmer's words alongside damning commentary. The moment was more than political misstep. It was a moral crisis that exposed deep fractures within the party, fractures that may now be impossible to repair. Commentators are already comparing the scene to historic moments in British politics where leaders faced irreversible scrutiny, moments that defined careers, parties, and even the country's trajectory. But the shock of the interview goes beyond the words themselves. Sources inside ITV have described the studio atmosphere as tense, almost apocalyptic, with producers whispering updates to executives as Starmer continued unflinchingly to admit what many had suspected, but no one had dared to say aloud. The admissions reportedly involved backroom deals, controversial policy reversals, and a failure to act on intelligence that could have prevented national crises. Critics say that for years, the public had been misled, promised transparency and accountability, only to learn that decisions were being made in secret corridors while ordinary citizens were left vulnerable. Even within his own team, allies were described as stunned and horrified, unsure whether they could publicly defend actions that had now been broadcast for the entire nation to judge. Outside Westminster, the impact was palpable. Demonstrators gathered outside Parliament, waving banners demanding accountability, while pundits and media outlets debated endlessly on air. Every moment of silence in the interview became a moment of tension for millions of viewers, each pause a reminder that a political earthquake was unfolding live. The opposition, smelling weakness, immediately began orchestrating public campaigns and parliamentary inquiries determined to turn Starmer's unthinkable admission into a historic downfall. Royal commentators too weighed in quietly, noting that the admission could have implications far beyond politics, touching on the relationship between the monarchy and government at a time when public trust was already fragile. In the corridors of power, sources say the Prime Minister's team attempted damage control, but the speed at which information spread made it almost impossible to regain narrative control. Within hours, every major news outlet, political podcast and social media feed was dominated by the same shocking clip. Former advisers who had long criticised Starmer in private spoke anonymously to reporters, confirming that the statements made on ITV matched what they had warned would become a public scandal if leaked. Analysts now suggest that this is the beginning of a prolonged crisis, one that may redefine political alliances, reshape the Labour Party and potentially alter the course of the next election. Even international observers have taken notice. Political analysts in Washington, Brussels and Moscow are reportedly monitoring the situation closely, recognising that the instability in Britain could have ripple effects across trade, security and diplomatic relations. For ordinary citizens, the moment has become deeply personal. Conversations at homes, pubs and offices reflect anger, disbelief and fear. How could a leader entrusted with the country's welfare admit such shocking decisions in front of a live audience? And yet, as the dust settles from the interview, questions remain. Was Starmer's admission a moment of honesty or a desperate attempt to control a narrative that had already escaped him? Was this the beginning of accountability or the prelude to deeper chaos? The UK now stands at a precipice. Within hours of the broadcast, analysts are calling it the most significant political admission in decades. Some warn that if the fallout continues unchecked, it could lead to resignations, a collapse of trust in Parliament and a wider crisis of governance. The Prime Minister's legacy, already contested, hangs by a thread. And while the public reels from what was just exposed, insiders suggest there is far more to come. Documents, whispers and confidential reports are said to be circulating within government circles, potentially capable of igniting a storm even larger than this televised confession. As Britain grapples with disbelief, the nation is left with a single burning question. What exactly did Starmer admit that has the entire country on edge, and how far will the consequences reach? Was this confession the tip of the iceberg or merely the beginning of a chain reaction that could shatter political stability entirely? The answer may redefine the very notion of leadership in the United Kingdom. Cliffhanger question, but as the dust settles on this historic ITV moment, insiders warn, could Starmer's admission be just the beginning of a political earthquake far larger than anyone has yet imagined? Within hours of the ITV interview, the country's political machinery began to implode. The admission that had stunned the nation did not simply fade from headlines, it ignited a wildfire of outrage, distrust and speculation. Westminster, once a bastion of controlled procedure and composed rhetoric, was thrown into complete disarray. Ministers were summoned for emergency briefings, advisers whispered behind closed doors, and civil servants scurried to contain what many now openly called a historic governance crisis. Sources inside Number 10 reveal that meetings continued late into the night, the air thick with tension and fear. Allies who had supported Starmer for years now questioned their own loyalty, unsure if they could defend actions that had just been revealed in public, live, before millions of viewers. Every word he spoke on ITV became a weapon in the hands of opposition figures who immediately seized the moment to accuse the Prime Minister of betrayal, moral failure and secret deals that put power over people. Across social media, the response was ferocious. Within minutes, the hashtag storm erupted, trending nationwide, and clips of Starmer's faltering voice, shaky admissions and visible unease went viral. Public outrage surged, with commentators, pundits and ordinary citizens alike questioning not only his decisions, but his integrity. How could a Prime Minister allow this, became the repeated question on feeds across the country. Protesters began gathering outside Parliament, waving banners demanding accountability, while others called for immediate resignation. The sense of a moral reckoning was palpable, a moment when trust in leadership collided with a shocking exposure that had been decades in the making. Meanwhile, the opposition was orchestrating a coordinated political offensive. Nigel Farage, Richard Tice and other party leaders capitalised on the chaos, releasing statements that painted Starmer not merely as a politician who erred, but as a leader who had failed the nation at a historic scale. Every allegation, every leaked document and every insider confession was amplified in the wake of the ITV revelation. Inside the government, sources describe a team in near panic. Cabinet members convened emergency sessions to draft damage control strategies. Yet every attempt seemed inadequate. Every spokesperson's statement was scrutinised against Starmer's own words, and the gap between public perception and government messaging widened dangerously. Allies whispered that Starmer's admission had opened a Pandora's box. Documents previously shielded from scrutiny were now at risk of leaking. Emails were being scanned by journalists, and confidential memos were reportedly circulating among opposition strategists. Even the Labour Party's internal communications were in turmoil, with staff unsure whether to defend the Prime Minister or distance themselves entirely. The sense of collapse was not hypothetical, it was immediate, tangible, and visible in every frantic meeting, every whispered phone call, every televised response. The shockwaves extended beyond domestic politics. International observers who had long monitored the UK's political stability began expressing concern. In Brussels, senior EU officials were reportedly convening emergency briefings to assess potential impacts on ongoing agreements. In Washington, analysts questioned whether Britain could maintain credibility in diplomatic negotiations amid what is being described as a moment of national vulnerability. Even Moscow and Beijing were reportedly monitoring developments, recognising that instability in London could shift economic, military and intelligence calculations. For ordinary citizens, the ITV interview became more than just a political scandal. It became evidence of systemic failure. People debated in pubs, offices and homes whether decisions were being made in secret corridors while the public paid the price. The moment had become a moral reckoning, a confrontation between trust and betrayal of democracy and secrecy. Adding fuel to the fire, reports emerged that the Prime Minister's ITV admission touched on sensitive issues involving royal oversight and emergency governance protocols. Whispers in political circles suggested that King Charles had been privately briefed on the decisions Starmer had confessed, and that the monarchy's patience was fraying. Royal commentators speculated that the revelation could spark unprecedented interventions, or at least public statements that would further embarrass the government. The idea that decisions made behind closed doors could now ripple into public perception threatened not just Starmer's leadership, but the delicate balance between the monarchy and elected officials, a balance that had historically been carefully managed. Meanwhile, leaks from senior aides hinted at even darker layers beneath the ITV admission. Allegedly, there were confidential agreements that may have undermined public welfare, decisions that critics argue prioritised elite interests over citizens' safety, economic stability and national security. Sources suggest that while Starmer attempted to frame his statements as transparency, insiders viewed the admission as an unintentional confession, a moral failure laid bare in the harshest possible spotlight. The more he spoke, the more questions arose. What else had been concealed? How deep did the decision-making failures go? Could this unravelling shatter the trust that had sustained his career and the Labour Party itself? Public tension, already raw, intensified as news outlets dissected every syllable. Former ministers, once loyal allies, spoke anonymously of shocking ignorance and catastrophic oversights, confirming fears that the Prime Minister's words were not merely politically damaging, but morally and historically significant. Analysts began comparing this moment to prior crises in British history. Scandals, resignations and betrayals that reshaped public trust and redefined leadership standards. It was increasingly clear that the ITV interview was not an isolated incident, but the spark that could ignite a broader political conflagration, a storm that might engulf not only Starmer, but the entire governing apparatus. And as the evening drew on, one question loomed over Westminster and the nation alike. Was this the culmination of years of secret missteps, or just the opening act of a political earthquake yet to come? How far would the fallout reach, and who would be held accountable when the dust settled? Could Starmer survive the storm he had inadvertently unleashed? Or was Britain witnessing the beginning of a historic collapse that would echo through generations? Cliffhanger question. With Starmer's admission now public and chaos spreading through both Westminster and the nation, what hidden truths remain undiscovered? And who will be the next to fall when the full scope of this crisis is revealed? The following morning, the fallout from Starmer's ITV admission reached a fever pitch. Westminster resembled a war zone of ideas, accusations and emergency meetings. Cabinet ministers who had remained loyal through years of turbulent politics now faced a moral and political dilemma. Defend a Prime Minister who had publicly admitted decisions that many considered a betrayal, or abandon him before the next wave of scandal broke. Reports suggest that urgent parliamentary sessions were called behind closed doors, aides rushed through corridors with folders of confidential memos, and press offices scrambled to release statements that could salvage credibility. But each attempt seemed only to fan the flames. In the streets, thousands of protesters gathered outside Parliament, waving banners demanding accountability, calling for resignations, and chanting slogans that captured the anger, fear, and disbelief of a nation suddenly questioning the very foundation of its governance. It was not simply a political crisis, it was a moral reckoning, a public confrontation with the fragile line between leadership and deception. Even the monarchy, typically silent on internal political matters, could not remain untouched. Insiders report that King Charles and Prince William convened in urgent private consultations, concerned about the public perception of government integrity. Royal commentators quietly speculated that the ITV revelation threatened to erode confidence not only in the Prime Minister but in the stability of Britain itself. Sources suggest that both the King and his heir were weighing their words carefully, balancing tradition and constitutional protocol against a rising tide of public outrage. The prospect of a statement, however measured, sent shockwaves through political circles. Starmer's own advisers reportedly feared that any royal commentary could amplify the chaos beyond repair, further delegitimising his authority at a time when every decision, every word and every breath seemed destined for scrutiny. Meanwhile, opposition figures mobilised with ruthless precision. Nigel Farage, Richard Tice and other critics seized the moment, calling for immediate inquiries, resignations and public accountability. Every word spoken by Starmer was dissected, every pause analysed as evidence of guilt or negligence. Parliamentary debates erupted, the media broadcasted live analysis, and public trust, already fragile, teetered on the brink. Former Labour officials spoke anonymously of systemic failures and hidden agendas, confirming that Starmer's admission was not an isolated lapse, but a window into years of decision shrouded in secrecy. Across social media, opinion polls and hashtags surged, reflecting a nation grappling with disbelief and anger. The narrative was clear. This was more than a political misstep. It was a fundamental challenge to democratic accountability itself. As the hours passed, new revelations began surfacing. Whistleblowers reportedly leaked internal documents confirming controversial policy reversals and backroom agreements that prioritised elite interests over public welfare. Analysts suggested that these disclosures could have long-lasting consequences, potentially destabilising financial systems, foreign alliances and domestic institutions. International observers, including the EU, the United States and even Russia, were reported to be monitoring developments closely, aware that Britain's internal turbulence might affect trade negotiations, security cooperation and diplomatic trust. The ITV interview, it seemed, had set off a chain reaction, one capable of reshaping global perceptions of British governance. The public, however, remained the most immediate witness to this unfolding drama. Streets, offices and homes buzzed with debate. Citizens questioned the legitimacy of decisions that had been made in secret, wondering if the promises of transparency and accountability they had been given were nothing but illusions. Commentators framed the crisis in stark moral terms: the people versus the elites, democracy versus secrecy, tradition versus corruption. Social media became a battlefield of outrage and speculation, with citizens demanding answers that the government struggled to provide. Starmer's moral authority, once firmly established, now seemed fractured, and with every passing hour, more cracks appeared in the edifice of power he had built. By mid-afternoon, whispers of resignations began circulating. Senior advisers, feeling the pressure of public scrutiny and internal moral conflict, reportedly debated whether to distance themselves from Starmer's leadership. Rumours suggested that key MPs were preparing statements condemning the decisions publicly, further isolating the Prime Minister. The sense of urgency was palpable. This was no longer just a scandal. It was a potential collapse of governance. Even allies who had remained loyal expressed doubts, fearing that continued defence of Starmer could irreparably damage their careers and credibility. The political theatre unfolding was tense, high stakes, and unprecedented in its scale. As the sun set, attention turned once more to the monarchy. Sources inside Buckingham Palace claim that urgent consultations were ongoing as advisers weighed whether intervention, public statement or silent observation would best protect the stability of the nation. Every option carried risk. A statement from the King could stabilise public trust or further inflame partisan divides. Silence might be perceived as complicity, eroding confidence in centuries of tradition. The decision, insiders say, could define not just the monarchy's role in contemporary politics, but the moral framework by which the nation judged leadership itself. And yet, even as these high-level manoeuvres unfolded, questions lingered in the public imagination. How deep did the missteps go? What other secrets had been concealed behind closed doors, now vulnerable to exposure? Could the Prime Minister survive a political maelstrom intensified by both domestic outrage and international scrutiny? Was the ITV admission a moment of accountability or merely the first act of a crisis that would engulf the nation in weeks to come? The nation waited, breathless, as the consequences of one unthinkable admission rippled through every layer of power, every corner of the country and every seat of influence. Cliffhanger question: with resignations rumoured, royal consultations underway, and opposition forces mobilised, the nation is left wondering, how far will this storm reach and who will ultimately pay the price for the unthinkable truths just revealed? Will Starmer endure, or is the collapse of his leadership now inevitable?